Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, perhaps in some places still. Thank you very much for joining us today. This conversation takes place in the context of the Movement for Reading Comprehension in Latin America, a growing coalition of civil society organizations, policymakers, and partners working together to improve foundational learning across the region. And today we are delighted to welcome Ben Piper. Ben is the director of the Global Education Program at the Gates Foundation, where he leads the foundation's strategy to improve foundational learning at scale across low and middle income countries. Ben, thank you very much for being with us today. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Buenos tardes, and thank you, Ignacio and team, for the opportunity to be with you today. It's a real honor.
Thank you very much. So we are hoping for an open and reflective conversation focused less on theory and more on what actually works when education systems attempt to improve learning outcomes for millions of children, a small task that we have in hand. And yes, with that in mind, let me start, Ben, with a big picture question. And this would be, we all know that in a world with vast needs and unlimited resources, prioritization is essential. So why is foundational learning strategic for national development? And why should governments place it at the very top of their policies agendas?
Thank you so much for that question. And it's true, particularly in the parts of the world where I work, the funding environment has changed dramatically. And so this issue of prioritization is even more important. But I think some of the answer goes to the name. We're talking about foundational learning. And foundational learning, it should be a priority because it's the starting point. It's the base. Everything else builds on the ability of children to have these basic literacy and numeracy skills. So I have been working in education my entire career, and I know that the education systems in Latin America and Caribbean have so many challenges. But Ignacio, team, this is one problem we know how to fix. Ignacio and I were struggling to get the internet to work to make this call happen. We don't know how to fix the internet. But this issue of teaching these wonderful, talented children in the LAC region how to read, that one we know how to do. There is so much evidence. There is so much evidence on cost effectiveness. There's so much evidence about how to do it at scale, about how to work with the system at the decentralized levels. It doesn't mean it's easy, Ignacio, but it does mean that this one is solvable. So I just had another partner of ours share some results from a new literacy program in another region, yet another program that has impacts. So this is a solvable problem. Number one. Number two, improving literacy outcomes is critical to unleash human capital that's needed to power economic growth. If you want to think about, I'm thinking maybe of a minister in LAC that is struggling with, how do I grow my economy? We have worries about STEM. We don't have enough progress on TVET. Over and over again, the evidence shows that one of the best pathways to STEM are literacy and numeracy skills. I was just in Senegal last week. We were talking about how numeracy is the first step to STEM, and you can't have children doing well in numeracy if they can't read the math problem. So it's the pathway to STEM. It's the pathway to technical and vocational skills. There's actually a very good paper by a partner, Kirsty Newman, who shows that if you're worried about TVET, technical vocational training, it actually starts with foundational learning and literacy. If you look at the gains in learning outcomes, if you have one standard deviation better learning outcomes, which is a big task, but it's very possible, you can have a 5% reduction in youth unemployment. There was a longitudinal study, Ignacio, very recently, both from Pakistan as well as from Indonesia, that shows that children who have these basic literacy skills have 11% or 12% more economic growth as adults. So the benefits are strong. And last thing I'd say is that it's also the great equalizer. I know so many countries in LAC are worried about, economic inequality. And what you basically have is a bifurcated, differentiated system in so many countries where the rich do well, not because of their talent or because of their hard work, but because of where they grew up, what school they went to. I was a benefit and in my own school in the United States. I went to a good school. It was a very unequal school, but my mother was doing her PhD, Ignacio, on teaching children how to read. And her dissertation was videotaping 2 children to learn to read when they were 2 and 3 years old. So I went to a very unequal school, but my mother, because of her dissertation, taught me how to read when I was 2 and 3 years old. So I went to a school that had blacks and whites together, but the very best reading level. Even in my grade 1 classroom, I have a picture of this grade 1 classroom, which was black and white. And I was the only black child in my top reading level, not because I'm talented, not because I'm hardworking, but because my mother taught me to read 3 years before I got to school. So if we want to have equality at the societal level, it starts off with equality at the basic skills. The pathway to catch up is much more difficult if these children don't have the basic skills in even grade 1. And I think particularly in so many countries in LAC that are learning Spanish, which is a relatively transparent language, it is possible to make a lot of gains even in grade 1. So I could go on and on. There are many reasons, but I think that's very clear that foundational learning should be strategic for national development. And I think it has impacts on economic growth, has impacts on the rest of the education sector, and even has impacts, last thing I'll say, on maternal and child health. The stat I love is that women with reading skills are 71% more likely to access care during pregnancy. I care about the girl herself, but even if you only care about the child that she's going to have, that child she's going to have is 71% more likely to have care during pregnancy. So many benefits to these basic skills.
Thank you very much, Ben. This explanation helps us a lot to frame the importance of the issue, and thank you also for that bit of your personal story, because it seems like your own mother's vocation helps to understand yours. So thank you.
That's right.
Also for
and I should say it goes one generation down. My oldest daughter is starting her first year of teaching in the US, and actually she's using the kind of science of reading methods as a special ed teacher, predominantly actually with children who speak Spanish at home. So it's a family business, but she's surpassing her father.
That's great. That's great. And there the Spanish connects us also. So let's now. I propose that we now move on from the why to the how, to speak a little bit about the evidence on what works in terms of foundational learning. And in this direction, my question would be, what can you tell us about what global evidence tell us about the conditions under which early literacy policies work at scale? And here we have a particular interest on what should governments do, right, to achieve serious transformation at scale.
No, I think this issue of how do governments make the policy choices they need to improve outcomes at scale is the kind of fundamental question of the education space right now. And I think fortunately we do have such a growing evidence base about what works to cost effectively improve outcomes. Now, Ignacio, you didn't say cost, but if I'm thinking about a government, I'm thinking about a country that is facing some economic crisis, or even just prioritization, as your last question said, you need to know that it's cost effective. And it's possible to do this within the context of existing government budgets. So I think there is quite a bit of evidence in 3 areas. There are 3 proven interventions that can scale, that have scaled through government systems. So the first one is something called structured pedagogy, which you can talk about, which is basically a set of materials for kids training for teachers, lesson plans for teachers, and coaching and system support for teachers. That's one, structured pedagogy, which has a lot of evidence, cost-effective evidence. There's also something called targeted instruction. Sometimes teaching at the right level, it has different names, but basically organizing the literacy class so that you have the children like Ben, who need to practice their letters or letter sounds in one group. And then you have children like Ignacio, who actually knows their letter sounds and knows how to use syllables and can read simple stories in another group. So you're targeting the instruction at our level. And then third, increasingly, we have evidence about how EdTech and AI can help particular challenges that schools and programs are facing. And I think actually the evidence based on EdTech and AI and literacy is actually strongest in LAC of all the regions in the world, including the US and Europe. I think there's more evidence recently and for the use of AI and EdTech from the Latin America, Caribbean area. So the system's ability to use a structured pedagogy or target instruction or AI program really depends on, number one, choosing the right type of method, and number two, having the system infrastructure in place to receive that method and make sure it works. I'm thinking about the first one, structured pedagogy. So basically, what does that mean? I was in a country last week that is implementing a structured pedagogy program. What does it look like? If I was to go to one of the countries on the call, it looks like a child with a book that looks exciting. It has colorful pages. It has stories at the right level. It has pictures that look like their home, like their village, but also is working at different levels of instruction. So in one page, you might have letter level, you might have syllable level, you might have word level, and you might have story level. That's what a page could look like. Some countries that have workbooks actually have places for the child to write a story or write some blending or segmenting activities. The teacher would have a set of materials, teacher's guide or lesson plan. And I think it's worth noting this. My views on this have really changed, Ignacio, and I'm not sure where people in the call feel. I was trained, my first job actually was a fourth grade teacher. So this is in my blood. And I had the advantage of being a fourth grade teacher trained by a professor who was actually well known in the reading space. She developed a program called the 4 Blocks program, which was a literacy intervention in the US. And I was one of her few students, and she was, worldwide US famous researcher. And so I was really well trained. I knew how to do the various activities, the blending, the segmenting, the comprehension activity, the writing activities. I learned it all. I went to my first class, Ignacio, 4th grade. I had, a wide range of skill levels, some kids who did very well. And then I had some children for whom English was a second language and some who were just struggling. I actually picked the school by the poverty level. It was the poorest school in the district. So I was well trained, and I was actually teaching in my first year the program that my professor developed, right? So I was lucky to pick a school that her program had been adopted. But I also was coming at it from a point of view philosophically that teacher should be the magician, that teacher is the only one who knows their students, knows the curriculum, and knows assessment, and that I should not be given a lesson plan. I'm the one who should be developing the lesson plan. And I promise you, Ignacio, within 4 months of teaching this classroom, pretty small scale, pretty small classroom by the context of countries I work in, it was only 26 children. I was asking desperately for, give me a lesson plan, give me some instructional materials that I could teach from, because it was hard. Now, I'm a good teacher, so I'm not reading it word for word. I'm using it as a guide to develop my lesson routines and give a good lesson. So that sort of approach, I had so many advantages. I was well trained. I was teaching a program that I knew, but I still benefited from having a structured lesson plan that would connect to what was in the student page. So my lesson plan would show me how to do the phonemic awareness lesson, the routine. It would show me how to do the syllable routine, would show me how to do the fluency routine, and critically would give me a lot of fun reading comprehension activities. That would make that classroom instruction exciting, but also it was systematic. So I had some lessons where I was doing retelling, some where they were doing prediction, some they were doing a mind map. The stories were vibrant. I had some that were read alouds, so that we could talk with the metacognitive processes. What do you think is going to happen next? Oh, was that what you expected? As I'm reading this, I'm thinking about my own brain. Do I understand that word? If I don't understand the word, I read it again. So it's a phonics-based program where there was enough time at the letter level, but it was a fun and engaging lesson. And that sort of approach is what I saw last week in Senegal. This teacher who didn't have the advantages I had. She wasn't trained by a world-famous professor. She didn't have, she wasn't teaching a program that her professor developed, but she did have enough support so that the instructional methods were effective. So this sort of structured pedagogy program, lesson plan, student book or textbook, also needs coaching and support to that teacher. I didn't have a good example of this when I was a first-year teacher, so I was only observed once for 5 minutes in the U.S. For my first year of teaching. But I think the good programs have kind of consistent follow-up. The teacher, Ben, needs to have Ignacio, who's an experienced teacher, watch me do my lesson, give me feedback on how my fluency activities should be more effective. I need to have kind of skills-based training where I see that lesson routine, that phonics blending activity. I see someone doing it in a very engaging, fast-moving, exciting thing where each child has an opportunity. So at a system level, well-meaning teachers, and by the way, I feel strongly that teachers are the countries who are listening to this. You can improve learning with the teachers you have in your classrooms. There might be other things you want to do to change the status of the teaching profession, but I think the evidence is pretty clear that using existing teachers and their existing skill level with enough support, they can improve learning. So we had this conversation in the country last week where they were talking about how to, change the teaching profession and increase the training level. I'm not against that, but I think there are program after program that even at scale, you can improve outcomes with the existing teachers, but they need support. They need structure. They need building around it. So yeah, that's kind of the type of program that you might use, Ignacio. But then there's also a little bit more evidence, and I'm not sure if you want to get into this now, but I could walk you through what this new recent paper says about literacy. Would this be a good time to do that?
Yes, sure. And in fact, Ben, I help you. I thank you so much for sharing these insights, because here in Latin America, also as in other parts of the world, this is a very difficult issue, and there are very strong opinions. So these insights come at a very good time.
Well, listen, I have strong opinions, but I've changed my mind twice based on evidence. And I think that's the question that all of us who are researchers need to do, is to be open to the evidence. And I think what we have now is kind of a much greater progress on what we know. So just to tell you about this new paper, the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel, which is a panel of well-known researchers from across the world. There's economists, there's educationists, there's policymakers. There's a wide range of researchers on the panel, and we're supported by some excellent researchers. So we have been doing these kind of cost effectiveness analyses of kind of what the best buys are for education. And that's been the main purpose of the panel. But just last week, 2 weeks ago, we launched a new and special paper on literacy. The basic idea was, I'm from the US, but I was working in Africa predominantly. And there was some pushback, Ignacio, on kind of, we're doing these literacy programs, but all the articles you are citing are from the rich world. They're from America, from the UK. So how do I know that we're using the right evidence that applies to my language? Particularly if you think about English compared to Spanish, English is not a transparent language. The letter sounds are not consistent. So if you're developing research on a lot of things that are English specific, maybe it doesn't apply in Spanish. I'm not a Spanish expert by any means, but I do know that there's a parallel in Africa and India where you have a lot of languages, a lot of countries that were doing these literacy programs, and there was questions. Are we depending too much on the National Reading Panel evidence from the US or the Rose Report from the UK, which were often cited? So what have we done in this paper? We have taken evidence from 160 new studies, which cover 170 plus languages. Okay, so there's dozens of new papers included in the new literacy paper from Latin America, and there are, as I said, 160 new papers. So what do we find? This first sentence is hard for me to say. We find that the failure to use evidence-based approaches to instruction is one of the main reasons that the literacy crisis is as bad as it is. That there have been countries and partners who have implemented literacy programs but have not followed what the literacy evidence says. So this is a solvable problem because it's just a decision. It's a policy choice. Are we going to follow what the evidence says or not? So one of the big questions we were faced as we started the analysis on this paper was, how much does the global idea of science of reading, how much does it change when we incorporate all of these new papers? As I said, 160 plus new papers. Does it change it completely? Do we have something that's specific for low and middle income countries that is different from rich countries? And in short, what we find is that the evidence has adapted slightly. Instead of 5 key areas of literacy, now we're suggesting 6. But there is now an update to the science of reading, which I think many of the readers or listeners to this presentation, podcast, interview might find interesting. We find that the most effective literacy programs should be explicit and systematic and should include 6 skills. And I'll let the listeners guess which is the new one. The first skill is oral language. It just makes sense that children need to be able to understand the words and vocabulary of the language that they're trying to read. Second, that there is importance on phonological awareness, that the idea that words have sounds and that those sounds can be manipulated. The third is phonics instruction. So one of the headline points in the paper is that evidence-based instruction that follows the science of reading does include phonics. There are 6 areas, so it's not only phonics. So it's 2 points in one. Phonics is critical, but it's not the only thing. And in fact, the best evidence, the best programs have all 6 of these elements. But kids do, including in Spanish, they do need time at the phonics level, being able to think about the relationships between letters and sounds, putting those letters and sounds together in syllables, and be able to decode words. Fourth is fluency. Kids need time reading. We want that reading to be fun, engaging, that we get lost in stories. I'm a teacher, but I'm also a father, and the joy of seeing my children excited about a story with people who look like them, who are interested in the same things. There's power in that. So we want kids to be able to have access to reading materials that provide sufficient time for practice. Kids need to practice reading. They need to struggle at the kind of developmentally appropriate levels. I believe in a lot of the programs have something called controlled text, so that particularly in grade 1, the kids have access to success in decoding and practicing fluency. The 5th area is comprehension. I said earlier that children need practice and training on how to comprehend. So what are the things that your brain does as you're reading? What are the metacognitive practices? As I said, the prediction activities, the retelling, the mind maps. There's lots of things that countries should do to have time on reading comprehension. And finally, writing. That there is a lot of time that's needed to learn spelling, to learn writing, to learn creative writing, and then there's a reciprocal relationship between the ability to write and spell and being able to read and decode. So that's what the paper says with respect to the what. 6 areas, and we need teachers having support. Now, listeners on the call can think about your country. Where are your strengths, and where are the areas of weakness and growth? But I think it's worth taking seriously the findings of the paper and thinking about the fact that, I heard this from some colleagues from Brazil. We actually had a joint visit with several of our partners to see what happened in Brazil, where Sobral and the state of Ceará had really substantial improvements in literacy. some of the best evidence anywhere in the world. So we actually just had a meeting in South Africa where with some partners from India, from South Africa, from Kenya, met together with some of the leaders in Brazil to learn what happened. And one of the things I found really compelling in that was this idea that you're only 7 once. This is from the Brazilians. You're only 7 once, and being able to like have the year 7 where not only do you have these basic skills, but you get the joy of reading. You get the joy of experiencing enough time with text in your language or a language that you can decode. And so how do we think about getting this evidence of these 6 areas in the literacy paper to this idea from Brazil that you're only 7 once? I think the paper also says that children learn to read best when the teaching instruction is explicit. So that teachers are explaining or modeling the skill before the students are practicing, that is systematic. I want these materials, and the best ones I've seen, they're beautiful, right? They have great illustrations, they're attractive, but underpinning it is a big spreadsheet. It's a very scientific structure that is thinking about the brain, not of my child, maybe not of your child, maybe not of me as when I was 7, but of that 7-year-old in the village who didn't have access to materials and doesn't have a wealthy family, but does have the ability to learn to read in a couple of years. So if we have this systematic approach, it makes it easier for that child with less oral language skills and less access to print. And then comprehensive. We need to make sure that all of these core skills are covered. And since any of them, if you skip them, it would hinder reading. So being able to have these kind of approaches driven by government. I'm actually a co-author of this paper with Jaime Saavedra from Peru, who works in the World Bank now. And he showed in his time in the bank what it means to have kind of a government leader who took seriously the task of improving literacy. And I'm sure there are many leaders on this call, listen to this podcast, who can have that kind of decision-making power. I was in the country last week. It was so inspiring. This minister had just lost his mother and he was on leave. And he wanted to have a meeting with me, even coming from leave, even just having lost his mother, because he was so committed to this task of making sure that all of the children in his country have the abilities of literacy. So yes, making time for one meeting is one thing, but making time to have this whole system work together to apply these proven cost-effective models like structured pedagogy and target instruction, including AI, can just make such a difference. And we've seen country after country recently that applying what this paper says, the paper is driven from countries. So there's many countries actually who are doing what's in the paper before the paper was written, because the paper is drawing from their experience. But anyway, we're just, as the Gates Foundation, just inspired by what so many countries have started to do. And hopefully as the paper and as this discussion and your movement for reading comprehension makes progress, that these leaders can really buy in and capitalize on what the evidence does say.
Thank you very much, Ben. This is so interesting. And in fact, Jaime also participated from this meeting a couple of days ago, last week. And also Bebeu Arruda, who was one of the majors of Sobral and one of the leaders of this reform in Brazil. So perhaps I would like to stay speaking with you forever and have so many questions, but time is limited. So perhaps one final question that I have for you is, you have showed us some insights about what the latest research shows, and you have extensive experience working with governments in Africa and also through the Gates Foundation. A lot of exposure to what's happening in different parts of the world. So perhaps my question would be, and now connecting right to this reading comprehension movement in Latin America, what would your suggestion for us would be? What have you find that governments are doing lately that is working? What lessons do you draw from large-scale reforms that you have been very close to in Africa? Perhaps the question is, what would you recommend as a next step for our movement here in Latin America?
Well, yeah, I'll give you some examples from Africa, but I guess the number one best example that's very current is in India. The prime minister wrote a new education policy a few years ago, and he made clear that foundational learning is such a priority that it's not nothing else in the policy. None of the other priorities will work unless foundational learning is fixed. So that's one of the statements in the national education policy, that this is kind of necessary for all the other priorities in the system. And India has made a real concerted effort to invest domestic resources in the materials and the training that teachers need, and the materials that kids will learn from. And several states have made pretty substantial missions to improve learning. I was just recently in India, and with a few other partners at the global level, we were able to observe what it looks like in India in a state called Uttar Pradesh. Now, Uttar Pradesh, Ignacio, is a state of 230 million people. I'm not sure where that ranks in the size of Latin American and Caribbean countries, but in the countries I know, 230 million people in a state is not a state. It's a huge country. I think it's number 5 or number 6 in the world if it was a country. And that state is a relatively poor state compared to the rest of India, but they invested in just the same package. Workbooks for every child that was designed following the science of reading, teacher's guide for the teacher following this kind of structured approach, coaching for the teacher, training for the teacher. The package is not different. But what they had in addition was the political will, government-led reform, political will. If you go to I see behind you a very beautiful painting. If you go to the district office in Uttar Pradesh in India, you wouldn't see a nice painting. You would see targets. What should it look like in grade 2? What's the fluency level and the letter knowledge level and the comprehension level that we need for grade 2 and grade 3? That's behind that district officer in India, because it's not just on the wall. It's something that people know. People took as their own task, having all of the kids in my district, all of the kids in my school, all of the kids in my classroom hitting these benchmarks and providing them the support they need. It makes it all the way down. From the teacher, who I know, I'm a big fan of teachers with support. They're willing to do it. They just need to see that it will work. That mid-level civil servant in that district office who's busy, but gets to the school and provides that instructional support. So India is a great example of what it takes to have this kind of full-fledged system of support that can improve outcomes. And the simple story is, when they did their most recent data collection at the state level, we found in this particular state that the percentage of kids who are hitting the benchmark for literacy more than doubled since before COVID. They were worried that maybe we'd be declining and hopefully we'll be a little bit not so bad. It more than doubled the percentage of kids who are there. Now, it's not good enough. I think when you talk to the leaders in India, they're not satisfied because there's still many kids who don't have these basic skills, but it is possible at large scale. We're seeing something similar in Zambia. We have a national level reform. I was just in Senegal, meeting with the minister and their team on this bilingual program. So it's the political will is the main point I want to say. And then also making some policy choices. So in Senegal, they're making a real push on bilingual programs. So it's both local language as well as French, making sure the kids have the skills. So there could be one of the things that the policy paper on literacy makes clear is that there's advantages of learning to read in your first language. So that's one policy choice you could make. A second policy choice would be this kind of question of phonics, and teachers develop teacher lesson plans. That's not popular in some countries, but being able to invest in that policy choice, I think, is paying off real dividends for many countries that have made it. And I'm thinking right now, again, of Senegal. It used to be a country that really believed in this kind of idea of, teacher from a philosophical point of view being the only one who can design the materials, but having this kind of lesson plan in their hand makes it much easier for them to do the hard task of government. The last one, again, I gave you an example from India. Now let me just actually go to my home country of the US. Not a country that's currently known for, a policy agreement on a few things, but this one is different. over the last couple of years, there's been a really substantial shift in implementation of science of reading-backed literacy programs. Despite some of the political turmoil, we've seen real progress on states both on the left and states on the right who are saying, okay, the evidence is strong. Science of reading tells us we need to have some phonics-based, not phonics only, but phonics-based instructional programs. So let's apply. So that the movement actually started in countries that are a little bit poorer, a little bit more right-wing, actually. And I think now we're seeing progress in some of the left-wing states to implement science of reading programs. So it's actually an exciting example of non-politically aligned, evidence-based programs that will improve learning outcomes. So in Africa, we're seeing this in South Africa, real progress in many provinces in South Africa applying evidence-based programs. We're seeing it in West Africa. We're seeing it in South Asia. So we're so excited to be able to share this paper, and I know there's just so many great examples. When I read the evidence, so much of it comes from Latin America and the Caribbean on how to improve foundational learning and literacy programs at scale, and I just think there are great examples. Africa and India are learning from Brazil. I'm sure there's many other countries in the region that are ready to surpass what Brazil has done on applying the best programs. So that combination of political will combined with evidence-based programs and really focusing on implementation fidelity. Let me be that last point I make, is that these programs that have the biggest impact, yes, they've made maybe a policy shift and they've made the hard choice on something that might be not easy to do, but they also have a system of implementation support so that you know in District A, B, and C who is implementing where the challenges are, and providing support to the teachers who are struggling. New interventions take time to get implemented, and so knowing where the things are going well and where they're not is one of the things that differentiates highly effective programs, that they do know implementation quality, and they are able to apply some of what we're learning from AI to solve challenges that teachers are facing, whether it comes from lesson preparation or assessment. There are particular things that we're seeing over and over again that AI is able to help solve. So I think, again, lots of evidence that we would look forward to learning from what's happening in your region.
Thank you, Ben. And it's so interesting that this final reflection has to do with political will, because it's in fact one of the main goals that we pursue at this reading comprehension movement in the region. And in fact, we are starting to have good examples about how civic society is working with governments to secure that political will. For instance, yes. in Argentina, yes, a couple of years ago, during the election year, we managed to get a commitment from all the presidential candidates to prioritize reading comprehension, and most of the governors did the same. It was a huge success for us. And also, just some weeks ago in Chile, our neighbor country, the main presidential candidates there also did a very similar commitment. That it's really encouraging. And you already spoke about Brazil, that also has an official, very robust official program. So, we are happy to see that political will is an important part of the puzzle, and this encourages us to keep working on this direction. So thank you.
I mean,
also about that.
All I know is that one of the toughest jobs in the world would be a minister or an education leader in a country. But if I was a minister or an education leader, this would be the thing I picked as my kind of signature program, because it will work. It's unlike other things where you're kind of guessing, I'm not sure. So it's a logical thing to put your energy behind. Again, going to the kind of Sobral, Sierra, Brazil idea, like having elections after elections won by the leaders who are showing that I can deliver on education quality. There's few things that you can be as confident in as foundational learning. It doesn't make it easy. I mean, having led a couple of these programs myself, it doesn't mean that you're not working very hard, but it does mean with that kind of energy behind it and expectation, it's possible. The reason why is because the kids are capable. It's us as policymakers and civil society who haven't done enough to make it possible for that 7-year-old who's only in class as a 7-year-old once to benefit the most from that 7-year-old instruction. It's up to us as policymakers, it's up to us as philanthropy to make it as easy as possible. And to get, more importantly, to get behind governments and leaders who are taking the task seriously. We actually have a new investment with other philanthropies in Africa, which is let's stop picking countries as philanthropy. Let's just follow the countries that are prioritizing evidence-based programs. So there's a new investment that we and some philanthropies are doing. Let's flip it. We're looking for countries who are prioritizing, who are putting their political will, who are investing domestic resources, and maybe our small amounts. Governments pay the most amount of money. Our small amounts can just make it a little bit easier for those governments who want to prioritize. And I'm much more confident in that sort of approach than the kind of approach where the funders are doing the most work, because it's fundamentally the governments, it's fundamentally the existing teacher, it's fundamentally the leaders in Chile, in Argentina, and Brazil, like you said, who are making those tough choices. I'm really excited to hear that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ben. This has been a very rich and thoughtful conversation. You have helped us to connect global evidence, system-level implementation, and practical lessons in a way that is highly relevant for our region. So thank you so much for this. And these insights that you have shared are extremely valuable for everyone working to make foundational learning a true priority across education systems in Latin America. So thank you so much for your time, your leadership, and for sharing your experience so generously with us today. Thank you, Ben.
Muchas gracias, and congratulations to you and the team. We look forward to having better stories and more stories from Latin America and Caribbean about what's possible. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, Ben. Thank you.